What if I told you that for decades, the main tool doctors have used to measure body composition, BMI, is fundamentally flawed and might be giving you a completely misleading picture of your health? In this video, we'll dive into where BMI came from, how it's used, and what we can use instead that gives us a better understanding of your own risk status. Let's get started. Welcome back, team, to the Building Lifelong Athletes podcast. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. If we haven't met yet, my name is Jordan Rennicke, and I'm a dual board certified physician in family and sports medicine. And the goal of this podcast is to keep you active and healthy for life through actionable, evidence-informed education. And today, we're moving past the number on the scale. We'll break down what your body is truly made of: fat, muscle, bone, water, minerals, all those fun things, and understand why these components are crucial and imperative for evaluating your real health risks. And that's what we're going to look at today. So now let's talk about the history of body mass index, or BMI. So this has become the primary tool for classifying weight status and screening for obesity. But here's some critical context. BMI was first described in the 1830s by a Belgian mathematician and statistician, not a physician. His goal was to apply a statistical method to define the quote-unquote average man. It was created as a tool for population-level statistical analysis and was never intended by its creator to diagnose health or disease in any individual patient. And the reason it's still used today is because it's simple and cheap, right? Which makes it very practical for tracking obesity trends across a vast population in public health studies. However, and this is the key point, its utility at the population level does not translate to accuracy when assessing you as an individual or your own patients. The most critical and widely recognized flaw of BMI is that it cannot distinguish between fat mass and lean mass. As a simple ratio of height to weight, it's a proxy for body mass, not your actual body fat percentage or adiposity. This leads to predictable misclassifications, right? So you can have a muscular athlete with a low body fat can easily be categorized as overweight or obese, while a sedentary individual with low muscle and high body fat might actually fall into the normal weight category. Both of these are misconstruing this risk. Obviously, one is much more common than the other in terms of the giant muscular athlete. That's pretty rare. You look at someone, oh, that's not right. If you see a BMI of 35 or something like that, and you see they're very, very muscular, usually that's not the case. Usually we're missing all those people who are at high risk, but are showing up as normal in there. So as I mentioned, this latter condition called normal weight obesity is associated with significant metabolic risk, but is completely invisible to BMI screening. And the data is pretty stark on this. A major systematic review found that using BMI of 30 or more to detect obesity had a sensitivity of only about 50%. This means it failed to identify half of all individuals who had excess adiposity when defined by their actual body fat percentage. Another huge flaw is that BMI provides zero information about where on your body that fat is located, right? And as it turns out, location is crucial. There's now overwhelming evidence that central or abdominal adiposity, particularly the dangerous visceral adipose tissue, so adipose tissue around the central organs, that is a far more potent driver of cardiometabolic risk and mortality than just overall adiposity. So if you just knew body fat percentage, that's way different than where it actually is distributed. And this means that a patient with a normal BMI, but a large waist circumference, can actually have a higher mortality risk than a patient who is quote unquote obese, who stores fat primarily in their gluteofemoral region, so kind of around their hips and their buttocks, something like that. Large-scale studies have shown that after you adjust for a person's waist circumference, a high BMI is often no longer significantly associated with increased mortality. This underscores that it's central adiposity, not just total mass, that is the primary driver of risk. Another major problem with BMI is that its meaning changes drastically depending on who you are. So the relationship between a BMI score and actual health risk is not constant across age, sex, and ethnicity. With advanced age, adults naturally lose muscle mass and gain fat mass. A person's BMI can remain stable for decades, completely masking this clinically significant and detrimental shift in their body composition. And for the same BMI score, women consistently have a higher body fat percentage than men, sometimes as much as 10%. Applying a single set of cutoffs ignores this fundamental biologic difference. And also, the standard BMI cutoffs were derived primarily from data on non-Hispanic white populations. We know that the relationship between BMI and body fat percentage differs substantially across different ethnic groups. For example, people of South and East Asian descent tend to have a higher body fat and greater cardiometabolic risk at lower BMI levels. This has led the World Health Organization to recommend a lower BMI cutoff for these populations. And finally, while BMI shows a general association with mortality in large populations, its predictive power for an individual is weak and often misleading. This is highlighted by the obesity paradox, right? Where individuals with an overweight BMI sometimes have better survival outcomes in certain diseases than their normal weight peers. This is likely because BMI doesn't account for the protective effects of high lean mass. Recognizing this, the AMA has adopted a formal policy in 2023 acknowledging BMI's significant limitations. The AMA highlighted that because the BMI scale was developed using data from non-representative, primarily white populations, it doesn't adequately predict health risks for many demographic groups and can lead to misclassification of risk in people for different ages, sexes, and ethnicities. So the AMA now advises physicians to use BMI only in conjunction with other valid risk measures such as waist circumference, importance in body composition analysis and cautions against using it as a sole criterion for denying appropriate medical care or insurance reimbursement. Now, I want to talk about a topic that maybe you've heard of before. So maybe you've heard about metabolic healthy obesity, or MHO. Some people talk about healthy at any size, meaning it doesn't matter what your body composition is. But this refers to a subset of individuals who meet the BMI criteria for obesity, but don't show the typical cluster of risk factors like insulin resistance, high blood pressure, or dyslipidemia. A clinician seeing a patient with a high BMI but normal lab values might be falsely reassured, but the evidence shows this is a precarious and often temporary state. Longitudinal studies consistently demonstrate that metabolically healthy obesity is not a stable condition, right? So one large study found that nearly 43% of individuals with this obesity, but they were metabolically healthy, at their baseline became metabolically unhealthy within just 2 years. So, and even while it lasts, it's not a benign condition though, right? So compared to metabolically healthy normal weight individuals, those with this metabolically healthy obesity still have a significantly higher long-term risk of developing type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular events. So it should be seen as a high-risk state. That does require proactive management. Obviously, it requires grace and understanding and talking about it in a neutral tone and having inclusive language and all that. But it is definitely not something we want to say, hey, the labs look good, you're totally not at risk, because that's just not true. But before we get into different technologies here for measuring body composition, first we need to define the key components we're actually looking for. And first up is fat mass, which is the total amount of lipid or fat in the body. It's the most variable part of our body weight, and we can break it down into two different types. First is essential fat, which is the fat you should absolutely need. You absolutely need this for normal functions, and it's found in your things like bone marrow, brain, organs, and it's not available as an energy reserve. The other type of fat is storage fat, which is the energy reserve stored in your adipose tissue. This is typically what we call, the body fat, and it's divided into two different subtypes. So first we have our subcutaneous fat, which is the fat located right underneath your skin. And then we do have another one though, and this is the one that we really have to worry about. It's called visceral fat. And this is the fat deposited deep in your abdomen around your organs, and it's a completely different beast. High visceral adipose tissue, it is highly active, secreting inflammatory proteins and hormones that are strongly linked to insulin resistance, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. Measuring and managing visceral fat is one of the most critical parts of modern risk assessment, and visceral fat and subcutaneous fat are not the same. On the other side of the equation is fat-free mass, or FFM. This is simply everything that isn't fat, a combination of water, protein, and minerals that make up your muscles, bones, organs, and other tissues. You'll also hear the term lean body mass, which for our purposes is basically the same. And a huge and vital portion of your FFM is skeletal muscle mass. So this is your body's largest protein reservoir, the primary tissue for movement, and a powerhouse that plays a huge role in metabolism and managing blood sugars after a meal. We also have bone mineral content, or BMC, which is the mineral part of your bones. Low BMC is a key indicator for osteopenia and osteoporosis. But now let's talk about a critical clinical point. So fat-free mass is a composite value, while skeletal muscle mass is just the muscle. Imagine a patient with heart failure who starts to retain fluid. A scan might show that their fat-free mass is stable or even increasing due to that water retention. And this could be dangerously misinterpreted as preserved muscle, when in reality their actual skeletal muscle mass, the tissue vital for strength and metabolic health, is declining. This is why the ability to measure skeletal muscle mass specifically is just so much more powerful if we can do this than just looking at the total fat-free mass number. Now let's move on to how we actually measure body composition. The first one is the 2C, or two compartment method. So it's beautifully simple, right? Divides your entire body into two things: fat mass and fat-free mass. Many well-known methods are based on this, including hydrostatic weighing, where you're weighed underwater, or air displacement, which you might know as the bod pod. But the two compartment models actually hinges on one really big assumption, that the density and water content of your fat-free mass are constant for everyone. And here's the wild part. Essentially, this came from a chemical analysis of about 3 male cadavers back in the mid-20th century. That's where we get these numbers from. So we now know that these assumptions are not right all the time, and they're frequently wrong. The composition of lean mass varies significantly with age, sex, ethnicity, and disease states. When the assumption isn't met, this model can produce significant errors, which is why we need to develop better models. And so we know the 2-compartment model has had problems, right? So now let's talk about the 3-compartment, or 3C model, which is designed specifically to fix these problems by directly measuring your total body water, which is a big step forward. The most common 3-compartment tool is the DEXA scan, and uses low-dose X-rays to give you 3 distinct readouts: your total fat mass, your bone mineral content, and your lean soft tissue. So it is a very, very good study. So we use this. This is almost a gold standard. It is wonderful. You get very accurate readings, but it does have its own key assumptions, right? So essentially, this looks at fat-free mass as kind of like, if you're building something, you're going to have bricks and mortar, right? So you have the muscle protein on the bricks and the mineral is going to be in the mortar, right? So this model assumes that every person using these bricks and mortar have the same ratio, and that's not necessarily true. It becomes a problem with patients who have issues like osteoporosis, who have less mortar, or those with muscle wasting conditions like cachexia have fewer bricks. And so the ratios aren't entirely there. So the assumption that we have aren't always going to be 100% accurate in these certain medical conditions. However, this is still a wonderful option. And if you got a DEXA, I think everyone's gonna be very happy. Like, this is good. Don't be like, oh, it's not perfect. There's always inherent flaws. So it's not 100% perfect, but pretty darn good. And so I just talked about how the 3C compartment's pretty darn good. We do have a better one, a 4C model. It's widely regarded as the gold standard, and it's what researchers use as their ultimate benchmark for accuracy, but it's not used clinically because it's just so inconvenient. So it isn't a single machine, right? To get the results, you have to get in 3 different tests at least. You're looking at a density test from the bod pod or body volume, an isotope dilution test for total body water, and a DEXA scan for bone mineral content. And so by directly measuring all these variables in your body, you get 4 different compartments and you pretty much get rid of all assumptions, which is why it's so accurate. However, as I mentioned before, it's super expensive, time consuming, and requires multiple machines, making it completely impractical for routine clinical use. So the key takeaway here is that you won't be getting a 4C scan from your doctor. Its main job is to serve as the benchmark that scientists use to test and validate ideas, and the accuracy we use for other tools like DEXA or bioelectrical impedance. And now I do want to talk about these additional technologies researchers might use. We have to talk about other imaging modalities as well in terms of MRI and CT scans. And while the 4C model is the gold standard for chemical composition, these are the gold standard for measuring body composition at the tissue and organ level. They provide unparalleled accuracy in differentiating specific fat depots like visceral versus subcutaneous fat, and they can assess both the size and quality of your skeletal muscle, even measuring fatty infiltration or myosteatosis. And the main barriers to using them routinely for body composition are their high cost, limited accessibility, and in the case of CT, significant radiation exposure. They're not appropriate as a primary screening tool for this reason. However, their role is rapidly changing due to opportunistic screenings, meaning someone gets a scan, there's millions of CTs and MRI scans that are performed all the time. And now with new AI and software, can we use those scans to then provide a body composition report? That's a possibility. But that being said, you're never going to order an MRI routinely just to say, I want to look at body composition, let's get an MRI. That's immediately going to get denied by insurance. But it can be used. You see this in research studies as well, and we can glean some information from them. Next, we move on to our gold standard here, kind of the clinical workhorse is the DEXA scan, or the dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, and it's become the most versatile tool for body composition assessment in both clinical and research settings. So it's a 3-compartment method that is used, uses low dose X-ray to accurately separate your body into bone mineral, fat mass, and lean soft tissue. And its key advantage is its ability to provide not only total body composition, but also regional data for your arms, legs, and trunk. This is clinically invaluable because it allows us to precisely measure appendicular lean mass, the muscle in your limbs, which is a standard metric used to diagnose sarcopenia. And the procedure is quick, involves very low radiation, and newer software can even estimate the amount of dangerous visceral adipose tissue as well. However, DEXA isn't perfect, and it's critical to understand its limitations. Its accuracy can be affected by a patient's hydration status, as fluid retention can be misread as lean mass. A bigger issue for tracking purposes is the results from a different DEXA scan and different manufacturers aren't directly comparable, so you might have some variation here. So ideally, you can have the same person, same scan, and use that over and over as a metric. That'd be ideal. And overall, price-wise, these can be obtained anywhere in the US for between $40 to $200 if you're paying out of pocket. It may be covered clinically, but a lot of times this is usually an out-of-pocket expense. It can be anywhere from what I've seen $40 to like $200. Another tool we have that can be more office-based is bioelectrical impedance analysis, or BIA. It's a non-invasive, quick, and relatively inexpensive method that's becoming very common in clinics and gyms. It works by passing a safe, low level of electrical current through the body. Lean tissue, which has higher water content, conducts electricity easier, while fat tissue does not. This device measures this impedance and uses it in equations to estimate your body composition. While simple consumer scales exist, medical grade devices are much more sophisticated, using multiple frequencies and separate measurements of your arms, leg, and trunk to improve the accuracy. However, the biggest challenge with BIA is its accuracy. The results are highly sensitive to anything that alters your hydration status, including recent exercise, food or beverage intake, or even the time of day. Rigorous standardized pre-test conditions are essential for this. This brings up the critical difference though between accuracy and precision. A BIA device can be very precise, giving you a consistent read every time, but that reading may consistently be inaccurate compared to the gold standard. And because of this, BIA is best used for tracking relative changes over time, not for making a definitive diagnosis from a single absolute value. And pricing for this can be reasonable as well. If you're going at this at a higher level here, it can be anywhere from $25 to $75. Sometimes in gyms, people just include this as part of their initial intake or whatnot. But as I mentioned before, 25 to 75, and this is good for tracking, maybe not the best for a definitive diagnosis, but can be helpful. And finally, I do want to touch on a method that you may have seen before, but it's rarely used in the modern clinical setting, which is Skinfold calipers. I remember being exercise physiology research assistant and doing this, thinking this was the coolest, and turns out it was pretty much a waste of time. But this technique involves using a caliper to measure the thickness of a fold of skin and subcutaneous fat underneath it at several standardized sites in the body. This is considered a doubly indirect method, which is a major source of error. First, it indirectly measures subcutaneous fat, and then it uses those numbers in a regression equation to indirectly predict your total body fat, compounding potential mistakes along the way, right? Its accuracy is notoriously low and highly dependent on the skill of the technician taking the measurement. It also assumes that the fat at a few selected sites is representative of your total body fat, which is an assumption that's often invalid. So given the high potential for error and availability of more reliable things like BLA and DEXA, the clinical utility of this is pretty low and pretty limited, and I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, so I've been talking about BMI a little bit before this, but I also want to mention some additional clinically relevant tests. So BMI is useful as a starting point. Absolutely can be very helpful, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Where you carry your fat on your body is more important, as we know, and it's more important than how much you weigh, right? So measurements of central adiposity or belly fat are more strongly linked to health risks like heart disease and type 2 diabetes. And so first one we can do is the waist circumference. This is a simple measurement of the distance around your waist. A larger waist circumference is associated with higher risk for health problems. So how to measure this step by step? So first thing you do is you find the top of your hip bones and the bottom of your ribs. You breathe out normally and then place a tape measure midway between these points in line with your belly button and wrap it around your waist loose enough to fit one finger inside the tape. Then you check the measurement. That's pretty much it. The next one we have is the waist to height ratio, and this compares your waist circumference to your height. We already know how to measure your waist here, so that's important. So waist to height. A general guideline is to keep your waist circumference less than half of your height. So that's one really quick thing there, which is really nice about this is, hey, if you keep your waist circumference less than half your height, that's a quick and dirty, pretty much are we risk or not at risk. Another one that we have is the waist to hip ratio. This measurement compares your waist circumference to your hip circumference. It can help show how much fat is stored around your waist, hip, and buttocks. So first thing you do is you wrap a flexible tape measure around the fullest part of your hips and buttocks, ensuring that the tape is level and snug, and then you're comparing that to your waist measurement, and you can spit out a value and you can look at it. And why are waist measurements better? Well, the primary limitation of BMI is that it doesn't distinguish between fat mass and lean mass, as I mentioned before. This means that a very muscular person could be overclassified as overweight or obese based on their BMI alone. And research consistently shows that waist measurements are more accurate predictors of cardiovascular disease and mortality. For example, a 2010 study published in Circulation found that waist to height ratio was a better predictor of cardiovascular disease death than BMI alone. Similarly, in 2015, another study in the Annals of Internal Medicine concluded that waist to hip ratio was more strongly associated with all-cause mortality than BMI. And by focusing where fat is distributed, these simple measurements provide a more accurate and personalized assessment for health risk than BMI ever could. Another great things about these is you can just add this on to your initial vitals, right? It might take a couple more seconds to get this, but once you do, you have much more clinically relevant information than BMI alone. And so now we've reviewed a bunch of these things. I've introduced BMI, all these different scans and measurements. After looking at all these things, the big question is, which one is best for a quick, reliable screen? The evidence is increasingly pointing towards a simple but powerful measurement, the waist to height ratio. So first, let's talk about its accuracy. Large-scale scientific reviews, some looking at data from hundreds of thousands of people, have consistently found that waist to height ratio is better predictor than BMI at predicting major health outcomes, things like heart disease, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes. While BMI gives us a general sense of weight, the weight to height ratio tells us about the location of that fat, and it's the fat around the midsection that we know is the most problematic, and this helps identify that. On top of that, one of the biggest advantages to this ratio is its elegant simplicity. The core guideline, keep your waist less than half your height, is incredibly easy to remember, right? And it's easy to calculate. This single rule works for men and women across nearly all ethnic backgrounds. This is a huge improvement over BMI, which has known limitations and requires different at-risk charts for different populations, like people of Asian descent, to be accurate. And this isn't just theory, though, from a few studies. It's being accepted as official policy. In 2022, the UK's National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, which is a major global authority on health guidelines, it formally updated its recommendations. They now advise people to use this height ratio to get a clearer picture of their health, and the National Health Services that integrate it into their public health messaging. This is a significant shift in the medical world. It's now recommended that if your BMI is under 35, we also do this. Typically, they say if your BMI is over 35, that's a pretty good understanding that we're probably going to have a metabolically unhealthy profile. But if you're under 35, adding on the waist to height ratio may be very helpful. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the weight to height ratio might help us find hidden risk, right? So many people can have a BMI in the healthy range, but they might still carry an unhealthy amount of visceral fat around their organs. So this is sometimes called normal weight obesity, as I mentioned before, but BMI completely misses these at-risk individuals. And because this ratio specifically focuses on abdominal fat, it effectively flags this risk, allowing for earlier intervention. It's a simple, empowering tool that people can use at home with just a tape measure to take control of their own health, or you can do it in clinic in just a few seconds. And okay, now we've talked about a lot of stuff. Let's shift our conversation a little bit for a second here. For decades, public health messaging has focused on almost exclusively the dangers of excess fat. And while it's crucial, it's only half the story. An equally important and often overlooked aspect of body composition is the maintenance of adequate lean mass, particularly your skeletal muscle mass. In this next section, we're going to explore why skeletal muscle mass is not merely structural tissue for movement. It's a critical metabolic and endocrine organ that plays a central role in regulating your systemic health and influencing your longevity. Skeletal muscle is your body's primary metabolic engine, and its mass is a key determinant of your metabolic health. First, your lean body mass is the single largest determinant of your resting metabolic rate, or RMR, which accounts for most of your daily energy expenditure. This has direct clinical implications. The age-related loss of muscle leads to a lowered RMR, contributing to the metabolic slowdown that facilitates fat gain later in life. It also means that weight loss interventions causing significant muscle loss will lower your RMR, making weight regain more likely. Second, muscle is very, very important for insulin sensitivity and is the largest mass of insulin-sensitive tissue in the body, acting as a crucial sink for blood sugar. It's responsible for approximately 80% of the insulin-mediated glucose disposal that happens after you eat a meal. So very, very important there. And because of this, low muscle mass is a major independent risk factor for developing insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And beyond its metabolic role, the most obvious importance of muscle is in physical function, right? Your mobility, balance, and ability to perform your daily activities. The age-related loss of muscle mass and strength is the primary driver of the clinical syndrome of frailty. So frailty is a state of decreased physiologic reserve and increased vulnerability to stressors. It dramatically elevates the risk of falls, fractures, hospitalizations, disability, and loss of independence in the older adults. But the connection goes deeper. Bone and muscle are intrinsically linked to what we call the muscle-bone unit. The mechanical forces your muscles exert on your skeleton are a primary stimulus for making your bone mineral density stronger. So this direct relationship means that sarcopenia is a major risk factor for osteoporosis. When a person has both conditions, it's hazardous. A hazardous combination known as osteosarcopenia, which synergistically increases their fracture risk. And beyond structure and metabolism, emerging research has revealed that skeletal muscle is a central signaling hub, a true endocrine organ. When you exercise, your contracting muscles synthesize and secrete hundreds of signaling proteins known as myokines. These molecules are released in your bloodstream and exert powerful effects on the organs throughout the body. One of the most well-known and well-studied myokines is interleukin-6 or IL-6, which when released from the muscle during exercise has potent and systemic anti-inflammatory effects. This positions muscle as a key regulator of chronic low-grade inflammation that underlies most age-related diseases. And furthermore, muscle directly fuels your immune system by producing glutamine, an essential energy source for immune cells. This reframes kind of exercise not as a way to get stronger, but as a potent anti-inflammatory and potential immune booster as well. But there's so many benefits to exercise we don't quite know of, but we know that they do release a lot of very, very important things. So it's much, much more than just an energy sink. And you might be thinking, okay, Jordan, like, what does this mean clinically? Well, the evidence is clear. Low muscle mass is a powerful and independent predictor of adverse outcomes across a vast spectrum of medical conditions. So very, very important. It also helps us understand and explain the obesity paradox. The survival advantage sometimes seen in people with a higher BMI, it may be because they have a higher absolute amount of lean mass, which is protective, which when measured properly, it's the lean mass that's beneficial while the excess fat remains a risk factor. So this leads kind of to a critical conclusion. The goal of simple weight loss is dangerously incomplete. A diet that causes you to lose a lot of weight might look successful on a scale, but if a large proportion of that loss was lean tissue, that's precious lean tissue, the intervention may have been kind of iatrogenically harmful, may have done more harm than good. And the clinical goal must be redefined from weight loss to improving body composition. This means using explicit strategies like ensuring adequate protein intake and prescribing resistance exercise to preserve or ideally build lean mass while losing fat. And all right, everybody, we've done a great job here. We've covered a lot of ground. We've deconstructed BMI, defined the key components of the body, reviewed different measurements and techniques, and established why lean mass is so important. In this final section, we're going to put it all together in a pragmatic, evidence-based framework. We'll translate all this complex science into a tiered workflow for patient assessment that you can use to have a more informed conversation with your doctor or your patients about their health. So how do we put this all together? Well, we can think of it as a 3-step workflow, right? So tier 1 is universal screening. At every annual health visit, clinicians should measure height, weight, and ideally waist circumference from these. And then from here, calculate BMI and the waist to height ratio. That'd be ideal. This provides a rapid screen for both general and central adiposity. Next, we kind of have tier 2. So tier 2 is at risk individuals for patients who've been flagged in tier 1 or those with conditions like type 2 diabetes or frailty. A medical grade, maybe bioelectrical impedance device can be used if so desired. It's an excellent tool for tracking changes in body composition over time in response to interventions, as we mentioned before, can be ideal, not fantastic, but maybe helpful for tracking changes. You can always throw a DEXA in there. A lot of times tier 3, we talk about more advanced things like DEXA, which may be helpful to diagnose something clinically like sarcopenia or osteoporosis. But it's kind of that understanding of, hey, what we're looking for here is tier 1. Everyone should be getting screening, right? Everyone gets screened. Hopefully we're doing the new thing with get the waist circumference as well. But either way, that kind of helps identify other people who are at risk. And then we can have a conversation and say, hey, do we need to use other tracking methods like bioelectrical impedance or DEXA to look further? Or can we say, hey, we're just going to track that waist height ratio, which is totally fine as well. And so now let's summarize the evidence-based cutoffs we've discussed. So values exceeding these thresholds should be considered a trigger for a deeper conversation with patients about these health risks. So for BMI, we know it's flaws, right? We know there's lots of flaws. The general threshold for obesity is a score greater than or equal to 30. But remember, for Asian populations, the threshold is essentially high risk at a lower. So at about 25 or greater is what we think about for those populations. For waist circumference, the general high risk thresholds are greater than 102 centimeters for men, or that's 40 inches, or greater than 88 centimeters or 35 inches for women. Again, for Asian populations, those numbers are lower, about 90 centimeters for men and 80 centimeters for women. And then the simple and universal waist height ratio, the threshold for all adults is about less than half, right? So which indicates an increased risk of cardiometabolic and mortality risk if you're above that half. So as we mentioned before, hopefully that's lower than half. So not too crazy, pretty simple. That's why another reason why I really like the waist height ratio. For everyone, it's pretty much the same. Saying, hey, if you're less than 0.5, you're good there. If you're above that, we're at a higher risk. Now, for the thresholds you'd get from more advanced tools like bioelectrical impedance or DEXA as well, right? So when measuring body fat percentage directly, the general thresholds for indicating obesity are 25 or greater for men and 32% or greater for women. And the appendicular lean mass index, or ALMI, which you can get from DEXA, it's a key marker for sarcopenia, right? A value of less than 7 kilograms per meter squared for men or 5.5 kilograms per meter squared for women is a threshold for increased risk. Once again, you're not getting these things unless you're getting DEXAs and more advanced imaging. So I'm just mentioning that for completeness. And then finally, for that dangerous visceral adipose tissue or VAT, an area over 100 to 160 centimeters squared, which can be measured by DEXA or CT, indicates a high risk for cardiometabolic disease. So, but once again, these are not set in stone. These vary from place to place, location to location, machine to machine. And so it's not entirely like as widespread. So from a clinical standpoint, waist height ratio going to be way, way, way better. But if you do get these advanced imaging things, you can look into these numbers. They may be helpful. And finally, it's worth mentioning where this field might be heading. So the most significant near-term development is likely the widespread implementation of opportunistic screening using AI-powered analysis in existing CT or MRI scans. So this could make a detailed body composition report of a standard part of every part of abdominal scan, providing a wealth of data at no extra cost, right? So you get a CT scan incidentally because you went to the ER, they may be able to use that to assess your body composition as well. At the same time, though, more accessible technologies like multi-frequency segmental bioelectrical impedance continue to improve, holding the promise to bring near DEXA level insights directly into the primary care office, which would be wonderful. And ultimately, the future of health assessment lies in personalized and multifaceted approach, right? The goal is to move beyond a single metric and integrate a person's complete body composition phenotype with their genetics, metabolic markers, lifestyle factors, all those things. That's hopefully coming down the line. But in a busy primary care appointment, when you have 15 minutes with the patient, using a simple screener can be very helpful. And that's going to be it for today. Thanks so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean the world to me if you either share this with a friend, leave a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, or subscribe on YouTube. Now, get off your phone, get outside, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.